I wonder if you can speak about the kinds of challenges that can occur when you have interagency, actually international groups working on the same mission. What do you do to assure that there's not just an operational coherence, but that there is a coherence of the fundamental objectives?
Well, that's the
or
big challenge.
complementarity?
There's no doubt about that's the big challenge. I was lucky in that Ambassador Crocker recruited me and also changed the responsibilities of the position before I got there. I was given line authority over all the U.S. civilian assistance, that's USAID, and the part that was funded from the $20 billion Iraq Reconstruction Fund that was originally appropriated in 2003. Now, by the time I got there, there wasn't much of that left, only about $1.5 billion. But it was, I had authority over the development assistance, classic development assistance, plus all of the other functional agencies. We had the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Energy, the Department of the Treasury, and so forth. They all reported to me, and Ambassador Crocker asked me to kind of make it all work. And because I had coordination of all the civilian parts of our effort in Iraq, the military wanted to work with us, and we were able to work with the military effectively. In days before I was there, and my predecessors didn't have the, if you will, the bureaucratic clout that I had, it was tougher to make it all sync up. Now, I won't suggest that it was easy. It was very hard for me too, and had successes and failures, but it was part of a trend. And now my successor, now twice removed in Iraq and also in Afghanistan, has been given the same collection of responsibilities, and it makes it easier. The other thing, I think, starting at the sort of the very top level, Ambassador Crocker and General Petraeus, famously enough, in the spring of 2007, agreed on a joint campaign plan, which, astoundingly enough, in Iraq was the first time there was a formal joint campaign plan between the civilian and military about what we were trying to do. And it had 4 lines of operation, as the military talks about it, one of which was economics. And I was in charge of the economic line of operations. So I was responsible from the standpoint of the joint campaign plan about looking at the strategy and integrating all of the elements of U.S. government involvement with the Iraqi economy, both from the very little post-conflict or what they call post-kinetic help in communities where there's been fighting, and we come in and start to clean up the damage and put people to work, all the way up to the national strategic level of an energy strategy or what have you. And that was a great advantage to me to try and knit all these things together. With respect to the international, other bilateral donors and the World Bank and other, the UN in particular, we were so big in Iraq relative to other players that we were able to kind of invite them to the embassy, and we did most of the talking about what we were doing and solicited ideas. There were particular sectors where other donors were particularly strong. For example, in agriculture, there was a wonderful Dane that had been there from 2003 who was an invaluable source of both insight and history and knowledge, and we used him a lot. And but it was not a formalized structure. I'm uneasy with too much international formalized structure. We did have the compact, the international compact, under which many donors organized their funds, and we worked with them and towards international compact meetings where the Iraqis made commitments.
Why were you hesitant to have a formalized structure?
Well, because maybe this is my bias, but I feel that the more formal the structure, the less substantive the conversations, and that you spend a lot of time negotiating leads and staffing out meetings, and less time on the real substance. And particularly in a situation like Iraq, where the United States' efforts were so disproportionately larger than other players. I felt it was better to give the other players the sense that we were interested in them for their substance rather than for the amount of money they bring to the table.
And allowed you to actually take advantage of real expertise
Exactly,
when you saw it, and
exactly,
you had the flexibility to respond quickly.
Right.
So, no, I
Right.
can understand. I had the pleasure of reading the speech the transcript of the speech that you gave at the London School of Economics early in 2008. And I was particularly interested in the way that you very clearly identified the challenges, the major challenges that Iraq is facing, because they're still facing some of these challenges. But I was interested to see that you gave tremendous importance to the process of formulating, approving, and implementing a national budget. Why do you think that's important politically and economically?
Well, we felt that it was important. The phase we were in last year, we still are in, is a phase in which the United States is turning over leadership. We're in a transition phase in Iraq. The Iraqis have taken over responsibility for their own security and for their own economy. And the instrument by which the Iraqis themselves take over reconstruction is their national budget. It is in the capital budget in particular of the national budget. And it is particularly important to the sustainability of the state that they be able to make priorities, set priorities, decide on infrastructure developments or other social needs that they have, and carry them out. So a lot of our capacity building assistance, which is the assistance to the organizations, the bureaucracies, to be able to make policy, has been oriented towards the capacity to devise programs and to carry them out, which has a budget at the national level is reflected in the budget. So we started at the provincial level back in 2006, and in assistance, technical assistance to the Ministry of Finance. By the time we got to 2008, the Iraqis were spending $3 to $4 billion a year of their own money on reconstruction. And the challenge for them was to be able to actually execute those decisions. We decided we're going to improve the irrigation network in the province of Wasit. How do we do that? How do we break that down into pieces? How do we contract it? How do we follow it up, measure the implementation of the project? How do we help the Ministry of Finance track the funds? And so that was a big priority for us. In fact, after the time at which I gave this speech, later on that summer of 2008, we established something called the Public Finance Management Action Group, which was a joint U.S. civilian led by Treasury and military effort to really get down into the nitty-gritty and help the Iraqis move the money to the pointy end where they needed to make a difference to ordinary people. And I was just in Iraq last month, and it's going actually quite well. Execution rates are up. They are much ahead of last year or the year before in their formulation of the budget for 2010, and we are finding less of a requirement for our contributions, which is the perfect development goal, which is to be able to withdraw the assistance that you're giving to a country in transition and allow them to take on the responsibility.
Have they been able to develop appropriate instruments of measuring effectiveness?
Not so much on measuring effectiveness. They're doing quite well on measuring implementation or execution. Yes. Measuring effectiveness in the context of sort of looking back on a project and seeing whether it's delivering against its goals and so forth. That's yet to come.
That's the next step.
That's the next step.
All right, good. I was also, and this is related, I was interested to hear your description of the need to develop a conflict-sensitive infrastructure. And you described the power grid, how Would you just expand on that? There was a power grid before.
Well, I mean, in Iraq, Iraq is actually a country, I don't know it's so typical of countries that find themselves in conflicts, because it under Saddam is an extremely centralized state, indeed an authoritarian state of great consistency. In Iraq, our goal, in order to help create an Iraq that's more sustainable, is to help them essentially create a more federal structure, empower the provinces, and so forth. In the Iraq that we found in 2003, the power grid was one other instrument of state power. It was designed to pull energy and generation from the provinces in order to support Baghdad. As a political matter, once we changed the political system, that actually, or once the Iraqis changed their own political system, that wasn't sustainable. They needed to be able to demonstrate that power, and if you will, inadequate power, was distributed more equitably. And that became an issue, a political issue within Iraqi politics, because the Baghdadis are closer to the center of power and made a lot more noise as they suffered a relatively larger impact of the shortfall of power. Over the last year, since 2008, power generation in the country is up about 20%, despite the fact that there's a drought. And so the political impact of this shared shortfall is declining as new power generation comes online and the blackouts are shorter. Nonetheless, it is a big problem. The economist in me and anybody looking at the situation will say, well, the fundamental problem with power in Iraq is they don't charge for it. It's state supplied or public sector supplied power is free. And as a result, it's wasted, and the demand is infinite. And on a per capita basis, Iraq now has power comparable to neighbors like Jordan, but it's still inadequate to demand because people have no cost to using it. That's the next step for them to take on to actually finally close the gap. Because as long as power is free, there will be a gap, an unmet demand gap.
So reconstruction does not necessarily mean putting the pieces back the way they were.
Well, in the development community, there's a challenge to introduce the concept of incentives
Yes.
in order to make a sustainable economic system.
And a viable political system.
That's correct.
So that the economic benefits are more equitably
Equitably shared and sustainable.
Yes.
That's the challenge. That's the challenge we face in Iraq. That's the challenge that's faced all over the world.
Well, thank you very much
My
for
pleasure.
your comments.